Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to those of you who are watching online as well. I am Sarah Perry. I'm Coalitions Manager for the Family Research Council. Today I have the pleasure of introducing one of FRC's most notable and long-standing allies, an individual who has used his platform to counter media half-truths, cultural biases, and left-wing elitism that for many years relegated conservatism to the shadows of American politics. Todd Starnes has been at Fox News Radio for more than a decade. His commentary is heard on hundreds of stations, and his syndicated column is read by millions. George Barna recently included him on a list of influential media individuals for Evangelical Christians in the 2016 elections. Starnes has covered some of the past decade's biggest stories, from politics to the culture wars, interviewing an array of celebrities and newsmakers. He is the author of 4 books, most recently, before today's, including God Bless America, a collection of essays documenting the war on religious liberty. In 2014, Starnes was awarded the National Religious Broadcasters Board of Directors Award. He is also the recipient of First Liberty Institute's Defender of the Faith Award, Vision America's National Hero of the Faith Award, Bot Radio Network's Watchman on the Wall Award, and Pacific Justice's Institute Light in Media Award. Starnes has delivered messages at the Ronald Reagan Ranch, the Billy Graham Training Center, and at FRC's own Value Voters Summit. Todd joins us today to discuss his most recent book, The Deplorables Guide to Making America Great Again. It is 1 part victory dance, 1 part clarion call, a reminder that the Republican victories of 2016 were only a starting point, and that we, the once forgotten, always pilloried irredeemables, still have much to do in reclaiming traditional values for America. Following the presentation, we'll be taking questions from the audience as well as our Facebook Live audience. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Todd Starnes.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, thank you all very much, and it is great to be here in the nation's capital. And certainly want to say hello to all of you deplorables that are watching us on our Facebook Live right now. Hello to we'll say a hello to a couple of folks out there. Shelby from Ohio is watching, so Shelby, thanks. And folks, be sure to get those likes going across the page and the hearts and the other emojis. Stay away from the negative emojis, though, so we don't want those. It really is an honor to be here with you as we travel across the country on our deplorable tour. And it's exciting to be back in Washington, D.C. Very busy week here in the nation's capital, and we'll be talking about some of those big issues a little bit later on. But I just want to say thank you to the Family Research Council. You guys have stayed the course, and you have been a beacon of light to the conservative movement in our great nation. And you have helped equip families and churches with the tools they need to fight the culture war. And so I just want to say thank you as a supporter of FRC. Your work is incredibly important in our nation. And before we begin, though, I do want to also invite you folks to follow us on Facebook, Todd Starnes FNC, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Todd Starnes. And we have a pretty awesome website where you can find all of our information at toddstarnes.com. Now, many of you who are watching online may not know who I am, so you might detect a little bit of a Southern accent. A lot of people say that I talk funny, that I drawl, but I just tell people I'm from the South and we like to savor our vowels, so we just hold on to them for a little bit. But I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee, and I still, even though I've been in New York City for about, 13 years now, I still take my tea sweet, my chicken fried, and my biscuits buttered. I still haven't gotten used to bagels, but I'm working on it. So I'm one of those people, though, that President Obama did talk about in 2007, one of those folks who clings to his gun and clings to his religion, and I'm one of those people that Hillary Clinton talked about in just about last year, 2016, when she called folks like you and me deplorables. And I am still, and I always do this, I'm still proud to call myself a gun-toting, Bible-clinging, deplorable son of a Baptist. And not bitter, not blessed. And I have some difficult news for Hillary Clinton today. She called us irredeemable, but I believe many of us here in this room and watching online are in fact redeemed. And this is not a time for a church sermon, but we'll do that later. I really felt like to cover the American liberal, I needed to live in their natural habitat. And that is why I moved to Brooklyn, New York. And I've lived there for quite some time. It's sort of like being on the mission field. My neighborhood is populated with vegetarians and yoga shops and farm-to-table restaurants that only serve organic eggs harvested by Amish midwives. I mean, it really is one of those unique hipster neighborhoods. My mailman does tell me that I'm the only member of the National Rifle Association in the neighborhood, and that's understandable. Lived just a couple of blocks away from Hillary Clinton. Her campaign headquarters was in my neighborhood, and I have to tell you, on election night, oh my goodness, it was just such a peaceful sleep, listening to the wailing and the gnashing of teeth from the nearby neighborhoods as her supporters just ran into the streets and threw themselves onto the ground. It was also where Bernie Sanders, and you guys might remember Bernie Sanders, everybody's favorite socialist, who owns multiple homes. And Bernie had a rally in our neighborhood, and I thought, this would be kind of fun to go check out a socialist rally. So I went and asked my neighbor, I said, where is the Bernie Sanders rally? And he said, I don't know, but just follow the smell of marijuana smoke and patchouli. So sure enough, I did, and there it was. I mean, just you could, it was like a little trail, like, Hansel and Gretel. And so there they were. It was Bernie Sanders and just thousands and thousands of these little socialists, and I noticed they were selling T-shirts. And I thought to myself, wow, those are really clever T-shirts. And I thought, I'm going to go buy one of those T-shirts. I'm going to get a T-shirt. So I went up to the guy, and I realized I didn't have my wallet with me. So I just told the fellow, I said, I want you to give me one of your T-shirts. He said, well, it's $20. I said, well, I don't have $20. I said, I want your T-shirt. He says, well, you got to pay for the T-shirt. I said, but I don't have a T-shirt. You got a T-shirt. I want your T-shirt. I said, isn't that what socialism is all about? And I didn't get the T-shirt. I had never seen so much capitalism going on at a socialist rally. It was just really quite remarkable. I believe that faith and freedom go hand in hand. Really from the early days of our great nation, that has been a truth. I tell a story in my book, The Deplorables Guide to Making America Great Again, about a pastor in Charleston, South Carolina. And of course, Charleston was a crucial place in the Revolutionary War. Without South Carolina, it would have been impossible to defeat the British. But they were having a difficult time in the upstate of the Carolinas recruiting an army to fight the British. So there was a man by the name of Oliver Hart. He was a Baptist. I'm a Baptist. I believe God is a Baptist, but that's for another day. He was a Baptist minister from the northern states, and he came down and he became the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina. And this Oliver Hart was sort of like Tony Perkins. If Tony Perkins was like there during the Revolutionary War, this is who he would have been, because he was a bold communicator. And he stood in the pulpit and he talked about issues involving politics. He talked about issues involving freedom and liberty. I mean, these are things that you won't hear in modern day pulpits here in America that much. Well, word of his communication skills reached a delegation of our founding fathers, and so they sent some men down to South Carolina, and they asked him if he would consider going out into the countryside and helping to recruit an army to fight the British. And he did. And that's exactly what happened. I find it interesting, and I mentioned this in the book, I find it interesting that when it came time to fight for our freedom, the founding fathers came to the church house first. I just think that was pretty interesting. I think there's a lesson for us here in modern day America. By the way, I mentioned to you the name of the book. I probably should have thanked Hillary for the title in the acknowledgments, but we were not quite sure what was going to happen. The book was coming, whoever won. It didn't matter if Hillary won or if Donald Trump won, there was going to be a book. And so the other title, this is the actual title of the book. If Hillary had won, it was called "We're Doomed America, Your Guide to a Happy Apocalypse." So that was the original title of the book. For the past 8 years, Americans have been told that we are the problem, that we are not a Christian nation, that we are not an exceptional nation. Our traditions and our values have been ridiculed and marginalized. We've been mocked by Hollywood and dismissed by the academics. We were marginalized by the mainstream media, bullied and belittled by the sex and gender revolutionaries. But all of that changed on Election Day with a man who promised to defend religious liberty, a man who promised to make America great again. Now, I have to tell you this, and this is a confession. Confession is good for the soul. Get those likes across now. Confession is good for the soul. Donald Trump was not my first choice, or my second choice, or my third or fourth choice in the Republican primary. But on Election Day, he was the only choice. And I believe that Hillary Clinton and that speech she gave in New York City about the basket of deplorables, I believe that was one of the turning points in the 2016 presidential race. I believe that many people finally realized what the Democratic Party really thought about folks who cherish traditional values, who cherish American sovereignty, who believe in things, the ideals like traditional marriage. And it wasn't just so much that she thought we were deplorable, but she thought we were irredeemable. They were telling us that our belief system is so egregious that we are beyond redemption. Many conservatives, though, I think, understood what was at stake on Election Day. And for me, and I suspect there are many folks out there who feel the same way, for me, the Supreme Court was the issue that compelled me to go and vote and compelled you to go and vote on Election Day. Now, let's talk about that, because the Supreme Court, Franklin Graham said we were at a moral tipping point. We know that the Supreme Court was going to be lost not just for an election cycle, but for generations. So how is the president doing so far? Well, contrary to the reporting of those in the fake news, we are still a sovereign nation. We haven't nuked anybody. We haven't been invaded by aliens from another galaxy. And Donald Trump has made overtures to defend religious liberty. He's protected the unborn. And his Supreme Court pick, Neil Gorsuch, is a solid choice. And I believe that we have the best vice president in generations. Mike Pence, I've got to say something about Mike Pence. A couple of days ago, the Washington Post did what was supposed to be a puff piece on Mrs. Pence, and it turned out to be a hit piece on the vice president. And the basic thrust of this article was that Mike Pence was faithful to his wife, as if that was a bad thing. I'm reading this story, and they were shocked to hear that Mike Pence follows the Billy Graham principle, or the Billy Graham rule, where you don't have a meal or you're not in a room alone with a woman who is not your wife. In other words, he did not want to be in a situation that might compromise his integrity. That is a good thing, Washington Post. So here's my thought about this. Who would you rather be married to, ladies? Someone like Mike Pence or, God forbid, Bill Clinton? I mean, just think about it, okay? I think a lot of folks would prefer Mike Pence. So I say good job, Mr. President. And if he's watching our Facebook live cast, because he could be, I mean, in the morning time he's watching Fox and Friends, but he could be freed up right now. There's just a piece of advice I'd like to give the president. The Freedom Caucus is your friend. And I would be very cautious about aligning with establishment Republicans. I'm not quite sure they have the interest of this administration at heart. And in the vernacular of The Godfather, one of my favorite movies of all time, I'm afraid Speaker Ryan could end up pulling a Fredo before it's all said and done. So Google that if you don't know what Fredo is. So. But we still, as a good of a job as President Trump is doing so far, we know that he is not going to do everything that we as conservatives, we as evangelicals, people of faith, want him to do. And there is still a very grim landscape across the fruited plain. And over the next few moments, I want to share with you some of the concerns I have about the state of American values and religious liberty. You see, far too many Christians and far too many Christian leaders have disengaged from the fight. They avoid discussing issues surrounding the culture war because they fear they might offend someone. And I've seen this time and time again. I've called pastors wanting to get a comment from a story, a situation happening in their towns, and they do not want to engage. You see, evangelical Christians have pretty much been silenced, but they've been silenced by their own hand. You see, many bought into this wrong-headed notion that we should only practice our faith inside the walls of our church. That's not in the Constitution. And now there is a prevailing belief among many Democrats, and believe it or not, some Republicans, that Christianity should be eradicated from the public marketplace. John Stonestreet addressed this issue in a brilliant breakpoint commentary titled, "You Really Want Us to Keep Our Faith to Ourselves?" And he imagined what a world would look like without Christianity's influence. Listen, I'm going to read this, what he wrote. For one thing, we wouldn't have thousands of volunteers in prisons to help incarcerated men and women return to their communities as productive citizens. We'd see fewer hospitals, fewer free clinics. After all, I've seen a lot of Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Catholic hospitals, but I can't remember any Buddhist or atheist or New Age hospitals, or for that matter, food kitchens or rescue missions or adoption agencies, or disaster relief organizations. And good luck sustaining free public education to the millions of students once religious schools are shut down. When Christians keep it to themselves, everybody loses. An associate professor of law and political science at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis warned that Christians who have avoided the culture wars may no longer have that choice. And he referenced the 2015 Supreme Court ruling that redefined marriage. Again, the Supreme Court redefining what God defined. And he pointed to an amicus brief filed by a religious freedom expert, Douglas Laycock. By the way, Mr. Laycock argued in favor of gay marriage. So just keep that in mind for a moment. Here's what he said. Must pastors, priests, and rabbis provide religious marriage counseling to same-sex couples? Must religious colleges provide married student housing to same-sex couples? Must churches and synagogues employ spouses in same-sex marriages, even though such employees would be publicly flouting the religious teachings they were hired to promote? Must religious organizations provide spousal fringe benefits to the same-sex spouses of any such employee they do hire? And he goes on and on and on and on. And his point is that people of faith, people who cherish religious liberty, are in danger of losing that religious liberty. And that comes from a pro-gay marriage religious liberty advocate. Just last year, the chairman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights warned that religious exemptions involving issues regarding sexual orientation and gender identity would significantly infringe upon civil rights, which is important based on what happened with the federal court ruling yesterday, including sexual orientation in civil rights. And here's what Martin Castro wrote. The phrase religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any other form of intolerance. It's just like Hillary's basket of deplorables all over again. So now you understand why it is imperative that Christians take a stand to defend religious liberty, because the fight goes on. Even though Donald Trump is in the White House, the fight goes on. You know, religious liberty is our first freedom. And I've often said that if the secularists are allowed to undermine our first freedom, every other freedom we have is in jeopardy. Look at the Pew Research study. They interviewed, polled millennials. 40% of millennials in America believe there should be limitations placed on free speech. Look at what they're doing to gun control in this country. Every single one of our rights is now in jeopardy. You know, we have to look at the military turned into a social engineering petri dish under the Obama administration. The other day, I received an email from an airman at Lackland Air Force Base. And let me stop here for a second and tell you that most of the stories, a lot of people ask me, Todd, where do you get all these crazy stories? Well, a lot of folks send them to me. And sure enough, we have a lot of military personnel that follow our column and our Facebook page, and they confidentially send me these documents. We check them out, and if we're able to verify their authenticity, we do a story. And sure enough, this email from an airman at Lackland Air Force Base, they were telling the officers, don't say offensive words like boy or girl or colonial or you people. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. There was a training briefing a few years ago that labeled the biggest threats of domestic extremism were coming from Roman Catholics and Evangelical Christians. And of course, the good people sitting here in this room, you guys were labeled a domestic hate group in another email that was sent out by the military. I don't think y'all are a hate group. Y'all are very nice, very pleasant people. So you had a whole table of Baptist martinis out there. So. Now, for you Lutherans, that's a Diet Coke, so don't freak out. So, anyway. But we are seeing these attacks in the military, and they're still going on. We've got to put a stop to it. Now, I have high hopes that General Mad Dog Mattis is going to root out this anti-Christian hostility that's infested the Pentagon. Radical Islam is another area that we talk about in the book, and the rise of radical Islam, we're seeing in our public schools where Islam is being given accommodation and Christianity is being marginalized. Just a couple of days ago, 2 moms from New Jersey filed a lawsuit against their school district. And the reason why is that their children were being indoctrinated on the Islamic faith inside a middle school classroom. They actually had the children reciting the Islamic conversion prayer. I mean, how would you like that? You're walking by your kid's classroom or bedroom at night, and they're praying, to Allah. What the heck is going on there in New Jersey? And I got to tell you something. You really don't want to mess with the New Jersey moms. I mean, Southern moms, they have the cast iron skillets, but the New Jersey moms, they don't have cast iron skillets, but they're still pretty fierce. So we'll see how this lawsuit goes. But thank goodness for those moms, because you see, instead of just dismissing it, instead of turning the other way, these moms took a stand. They took their concerns to the school board, and when the school board did not adequately address their concerns, they went out there and they got a lawyer from one of the religious liberty law firms, and they're fighting this. And that's what we have to do. We have to engage the culture. I've got a column coming out later today, and you can read it at foxnews.com. There's a public school up in New York near Syracuse, and a couple of students were involved in this college-level course. And they were trying to get the children to think critically. And so the teacher told the students, you have to defend the Holocaust. They told these students that they divided the group in half. And they told this side of the group, you have to defend exterminating Jews. Well, as you can imagine, a couple of these students were rather shocked by that and disgusted by that. So what did those kids do? Instead of following through with the assignment, they objected. And they took their concerns to the teachers and the administrators. And when they did not answer them, they took their concerns to the media. And then they took it to the State Board of Education. And just yesterday, the State Board of Education said, you know what? This was inappropriate. We should not have been teaching this in the classroom. Guess who was able to accomplish that, to eradicate that lesson plan? 2 kids who bothered to take a stand. Now, I don't know if those kids are Jewish or Christian, or maybe they're not of any faith at all. It doesn't matter, because they took a stand. They saw wrongdoing and they took a stand. Because far too long, we have been taught to stay silent in the face of this nonsense. And quite frankly, they need to go back and they need to fire every administrator, every person that was involved, any person who thought it was a good idea to teach kids that kind of garbage. But it's not just in the public schools. We're also seeing this in the workplace. And you guys know the stories of the Barronelle Stutzmans and the Kelvin Cochrans. I want to tell you about another family that you might not have heard about. They didn't get the national publicity. They're the Vanderboon family. Donald and Ellen Vanderboon, they own a meatpacking company near Grand Rapids, Michigan. I don't know the Vanderboons, but they sell beef, so they got to be good people. And they run the West Michigan Beef Company. Now, during the Obama administration, a USDA inspector came into the Vanderboons' business. Now, this is a privately owned business. And the Vanderboons happen to be devout Christian people. And there was some religious material there in the break room. Well, the USDA inspectors came by and said, hey, we need to have a word with you in your office. So the government agents, escorted Mr. Vanderboon to his office in his privately owned business. And they said, you got to get rid of those religious materials. They're offending our meat inspectors. And if you don't remove those documents, we're going to remove our inspectors. Now, I didn't know a lot about the meat packing business, but apparently if you don't have meat inspectors there, you can't operate your business. And so Mr. Vanderboom was faced with the decision, do you keep those materials there in the break room? And if you do, what are you going to do? What are you going to tell those 45 employees that are going to be unemployed? So he removed the materials, Mr. Vanderboon did. He's raised complaints with the government. He hasn't gotten any answers, which is why many organizations, including FRC and the American Family Association, have been urging President Trump to sign an executive order protecting religious liberty. We have to protect people like the Vanderboons and the Barronelle Stutzmans of the world. We have to do that. And so I'm really hoping the president does the right thing, and he's going to have a lot of pressure from members of his own family. So we have to encourage the president to do the right thing and save religious liberty, and quite frankly, save American jobs. You know, President Reagan said freedom is just one generation away from extinction, and last year we came pretty close. As I mentioned early on, Franklin Graham said we were at a moral tipping point. But I believe that God saw fit to give our country a second chance. I just believe that. You know, one of the key indicators of what happened last election cycle, it didn't get a lot of attention in the mainstream media, but Franklin Graham held prayer gatherings on the steps of every single state capitol in this country. No politicians allowed to speak. They could come and pray in the audience, but they weren't allowed on that platform. And I believe that God's people came together, and we prayed, and we mobilized. And it's an interesting thing, but when people of faith stand together, when we break down those denominational walls, when the Baptists and the Catholics and the Presbyterians and the Pentecostals, everybody stands together, we are a mighty voice. But you see, I have hope for America because of the young Christian men and women who are growing up in this country. I have hope in America because of a young man named Connor Brewer. Now, Connor was a football player at Millikan University. He's a big old fella. His teammates decided to protest the national anthem by remaining inside the locker room. But Connor chose to stand. And sure enough, When it came time to play the national anthem, the football team ran off to their designated safe space there in the locker room, and Connor stood alone on the sidelines as they played the national anthem. Somebody took a picture of that moment and sent it to us, and we told Connor's story to the nation. And I have hope because of a young man named Alex Dunn of Fayetteville, North Carolina. His teacher tried to set the American flag on fire inside the classroom. And when the flag would not burn, the teacher threw the flag on the floor. But Alex is a young patriot. His father serves in our military. And Alex, this 16-year-old boy, jumped to his feet in that classroom and ran up and snatched the flag off the floor and delivered it to the front office so it could be disposed of properly because it had been desecrated. But this young man took a stand. And I have hope in our nation because of a young cheerleader in Madison, Mississippi. Now, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, grew up right across the state line in DeSoto County, Mississippi, and I'm mighty proud of the Magnolia State. You see, last year, a federal judge appointed to the bench by President Obama told this public school that they would not be allowed to do anything remotely connected to religion. And if, in fact, it was perceived to be religious, every violation would result in a $10,000 fine. Well, it turned out that particular year, the high school marching band was doing a presentation of the song, How Great Thou Art, which is a favorite song in the Baptist hymnal. I'm not sure about your church, but it's a big song in the Baptist world, especially Mississippi. Everybody's a Baptist in Mississippi. Even the Catholics are Baptists there. Well, the principal was pretty good at math, so he tallied up the number of kids in the marching band, and he multiplied by 10,000, and he realized we don't have enough in the petty cash to pay the fine. So we called the kids to the front office, and he delivered the news. He said, kids, you can't perform your halftime show. We can't risk the judge coming in and saying that's a violation of the law. You can't play that song. You can't play your halftime routine. Well, Friday night came in Madison, Mississippi, and it was a warm, humid night under the bright lights of that football stadium. And halftime, the players run off to the locker rooms, and there was a very eerie silence that sort of settled over the field. Nobody knew what to do. There was no marching band on the field. Suddenly, there was a voice. It was a little girl, cheerleader, and she put down her pom-poms, and she started singing a familiar tune. Oh, Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder. And soon, one by one, moms and teachers and hairdressers, there was a police officer, everybody started standing to their feet. And soon the entire stadium was filled with people singing that song in defiance of their government. But they took a stand together in Madison, Mississippi. They took a stand for religious liberty. And I believe it is spreading like wildfire across this fruited plain. You see, Bonhoeffer once said that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And I do believe that this is a Bonhoeffer moment for every Bible-believing Christian in America. You see, God's little lambs can no longer be silent. We are to be civil lambs, but we cannot be silent lambs. There's a scene in this wonderful film. I'm a huge movie buff, and there's a scene in this movie called We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson, and it was a telling of the Battle of the La Drang Valley. And it was a pretty desperate situation. Lieutenant Colonel Halmore, who just went to be with the Lord recently, was there. His men were surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of the enemy. Joe Galloway was there, a reporter with United Press International. He was caught in the melee, and when the bullets started flying, the reporter dropped to the ground. Well, about that time, in the middle of all this chaos and all of this carnage, there was a sergeant major by the name of Basil Plumley, and he stood resolute. And I would pretty much expect anyone named Basil Plumley to stand resolute. And he walked over to that quivering reporter on the ground, and he gave him a swift kick with his boot. And he said, "You can't take no pictures from down there, Sonny." And then he tossed the reporter a rifle. And the reporter rejected the weapon. Said, I'm a non-combatant. And that old crusty sergeant major looked at that journalist and said, there ain't no such thing today. And I believe that we are in a very similar situation. You see, the cultural bullets are flying. The enemies of freedom are advancing, and the time has come for all of us to stand resolute. Now, you might say, Todd, I'm not a fighter. Well, there ain't no such thing today, because we are freedom's last line of defense. So I say this, do not hide liberty's light under a bushel. No, hold it high, and let the flame of freedom burn bright for all the world to see. You see, I believe, and as I write in my book, I believe it's time for every gun-toting, Bible-clinging, deplorable American to take a thunderous stand for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you very much. Now, all of you Facebook folks, don't go away because we're about to do some Q&A here. So if you happen to have a question that you would like asked, be sure to write it there, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And we have some questions here in the audience as well. Yes.
So in that closing, and you alluded to it earlier, my question is, has it come to a time for us Christians to respond? I'll give you two quick examples. North Carolina, the NCAA doesn't want to have basketball games there. Do we all lock arms and say we're not going to watch NCAA basketball for a year or two? Georgia, they don't want to have a religious freedom bill. The NFL doesn't want to have the Super Bowl there. Do we all lock arms as a church and say we're not going to watch football for a year or two? And for me personally, that'd be painful. But hasn't it come to that point in time where if we don't respond, they're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, I've never been a huge proponent of boycotts. There are some things that I will say, you know what, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your dollar, but here's what I'm going to do with mine. I think those decisions are made individually. But you raise an interesting point with North Carolina because, you know, the NCAA is now going to, you know, reconsider going back into the state. It would be interesting to see what happens if Christians would in fact boycott those basketball games for a couple of seasons, and again do what they're doing to the states. You know, those like big business in Georgia, you know, Coca-Cola. Those companies were putting the screws to the governor there. By the way, the NCAA, and maybe somebody from the NCAA is watching here. Why are you guys so obsessed with having grown men in the bathrooms with little girls? I'm just kind of curious. So we called your press person, and he didn't answer us yesterday. So I'm just kind of curious.
Other questions?
Yes.
Todd, I have a question for you. For the individual who reads the book and post-election realizes that their votes, their voice, their influence makes a difference, and who reads your book, what would you tell them to do now that they realize that the landscape in some respects is still fairly grim? What would you tell them to do?
Well, we have to get involved. And one of the things that I heard from our readers, my last book was God Bless America. And that really was, this is the evidence, folks. This is what's happening to your country. And a lot of folks were saying, okay, well, what do we do? Well, that's the point of the Deplorables Guide. After every chapter, we have very practical things, marching orders, things that you can do that do not cost any money at all. I'll give you an example. I think one of the crucial places that we have to fight back is in our public school system, because the liberals are using it against us. The secularists are using our public schools against us. So I think moms and dads need to get involved. Franklin Graham said we need to have Christians running for school board in every city, every town in America. I agree with that. But beyond that, one of the issues is Common Core, and especially the teaching of American history. And I believe every parent in America needs to take personal responsibility for teaching their children about American history and government. Teach your kids about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And you know what? Going to Disney World is great. That's a lot of fun. But why not take a vacation to, say, historical Williamsburg or walk the Freedom Trail in Boston? Bring history, American history, alive for your kids.
Other questions?
Todd, in the various, interactions with the public that you have through your radio show and other things, and do you get a sense of what, sort of public, sort of energy is like in terms of, conservatives versus liberals? One of the things that's interesting to me is that since the election, it seems like TV ratings for liberal, shows and channels has really sort of gone up a lot. And I seem to get a sense of the conservatives are sort of coasting, like we've got the Trump administration and everything's hunky-dory. But I don't know, what do you get a sense of these? Are these numbers just sort of, chimeras, or are they, anyway?
Well, a couple of things. I know we've got the nasty women took over and marched and did all sorts of things here in Washington, D.C., and you've had all these protests, the pillaging and the plundering and the burning of American cities. Conservatives don't do that, mainly because we have jobs. We have to go to work. We got to pay the bills. So we don't have that luxury. But I will say this, and I write about this in the Deplorables guide, that there's a cautionary tale. Reagan brought mourning to America. And what happened? Conservatives, the moral majority, everybody sat back in the lazy boys. They drank their Baptist martini, and they said, well, all right, everything's hunky-dory. Well, it wasn't too long before we had Read My Lips, and a generation later, we had a community organizer, in the White House. So the lesson here is we still have work to do. We have responsibilities, and a lot of people say we got to take back Washington. Well, you know what? That sounds real sexy, and that's the big fundraising pitch. We got to take back Washington. But if we don't take back our own homes and neighborhoods first, what's the point? It's not going to work. So we've got a lot of work to do in our own neck of the woods.
Other questions from the audience?
What can Americans do to combat the fake media? I mean, we call it the mainstream media, but it really isn't anymore. And yet they still wield incredible influence. Yeah,
it's, for one thing, you should watch Fox News and read my website. We have a lot of great stories there. It's important. You are a news consumer, and you have a responsibility to make sure that you're getting your information from reliable sources. One of the things I do is I read the New York Times. I read the Washington Post, USA Today. And it gives you some semblance of what may or may not have happened. But when you read all those stories together, you sort of figure it all out. That's a problem, and journalism has a big problem. I'm a commentator now, so I get to give my opinion. But unfortunately, a lot of reporters are giving their opinions in news stories, and that is a big problem. We were doing a book signing in Wichita, and this couple came up to me. It was a couple of weeks ago, and they said, Todd, my husband and I, we gave up Fox News for Lent. And I thought, oh my gosh, you poor people. And the husband says, you don't know the half of it. We're thinking about converting. So, anyway, I'm not sure that's a good reason to convert, but I sympathize.
So we have a question from our online audience.
Okay, Todd, this question comes from Michael Perry. The question is the main objective of the liberals is to simply keep up the pressure until the conservative Bible believers get tired and quit responding? So the main deal is to keep the pressure up until everybody quits responding on our side.
Oh, that's exactly what they're counting on, because we've done it time and time again. They know that we're not in it for the long haul. I remember something Vice President Cheney said years ago, right after 9/11. And they were talking about where we were going to fight the war on terrorism. And what the vice president said, I'm not sure that the American people are going to be able to have the stomach for a long, drawn-out fight. What it's actually going to take to defeat the terrorist. And it's a valid point that he had, because after a while, people just get tired. Our attention spans are very small these days, very small. So we have to, that's why, the culture impact teams, I'm just a huge proponent of those. It is so important for local churches to get plugged in to the fight here. And that's a great way for it to happen. And I wrote about that in the book. So, because it is a major thing that we've got to do is really get our churches engaged.
Todd, do you think that churches hold the key to community organization and involvement? Because the liberals seem to have cornered that market. We saw the Day Without a Woman, the Women's March on Washington, the post-Trump protests, and we've all been told that they're organic. And these happen as a function specifically of the political climate, and everyone comes together, and whether or not there's a larger influence, which some of us believe there are, behind this. What do you think holds the key for us as conservatives? Is it getting the church involved at the grassroots level?
I think the church has to be involved. I mean, when you go back and really look at what happened during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that was an effort that was birthed in the church house. I mean, this was just a deeply religious thing that happened here. It was right and wrong. Those were the issues they were talking about. My colleague at Fox News, Ed Henry, just wrote a book. It came out yesterday, talking about the faith of Jackie Robinson. That was something that the movie sort of whitewashed. They didn't talk about that. But it was this incredible story of how the faith, the Christian faith of Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey, both Methodist men, and Branch Rickey thinks God's a Methodist, but we know he's wrong. But they came together, and it was a result of their deep faith in Christ that they were able to accomplish what they accomplished and open the doors to baseball for people regardless of the color of their skin. I mean, those are the stories I'm talking about here, because I believe the church can be a change agent and can do good in the communities. And I believe pastors have an obligation, ministers have an obligation to speak up about these issues from the pulpit. Absolutely believe it.
If there are no more questions. Oh, one more.
I just wanted to make a comment on the Mike Pence situation, and maybe you'd comment, and maybe you'd write about this someday. I just had two things that I saw in it. First of all, almost every month in this country now we see another story of a school teacher having sex with a student, both male and female. So the thought was, wouldn't it be nice if school teachers adopted the Mike Pence policy that I'm not going to be alone with a student? And then we see in the sports culture, especially young male athletes that troll and take advantage of women. Here's a man in a position of power who chooses not to in any way reflect badly on his wife. So your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a great point. I think our biggest issue in this country is we are in need of revival. And I remember when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, who knew the 70s were the good old days? But we would gather around our TVs. We had our, 3 channels plus PBS. And I remember when Billy Graham would have his crusades, and it would actually be broadcast during prime time. They would interrupt programming, in the evening so people could sit in front of their TV sets. It was like the whole country kind of went to church together. Had a revival service together, and I think that we need to have something like that happen again. I think there needs to be an understanding that our country is founded on Judeo-Christian values and concepts, flavors every single document that we've got, every single one of our founding documents. And let's face it, that's what makes us different from every other country on the face of the earth. So just something for us to consider as we pray about where we're going as a country. Well, look, I just want to say thank you very much. We're heading off to St. Louis, so anybody watching in St. Louis will be there tomorrow doing a big event, and then off to San Diego. Apparently there are a lot of deplorable people in San Diego, so we're going to say hello to them as well. Family Research Council, thank you so very much.